This is a quick SnapInteract tutorial where I'll walk you through how to set up the SnapToggleAnimationPair component. Let's begin. So I've got this simple scene set up here. We've got the prefab character that comes with the package, and I've got a chair model. The first thing we need to do is select the chair and tag it as an interactable component. Next, we need to add an empty game object to the chair that will serve as the position anchor for the player. So the position anchor comes into play when the player walks up to the chair and initiates the interaction. The player will be physically moved to the anchor position so that the player and the object line up for animation purposes. So you can customize where the player is positioned relative to the object to make whatever animation sequence you're trying to build look as cohesive as possible. One other thing to note is, since this is a chair, what we need to do also is rotate the anchor so that it's facing in the opposite direction. You'll notice that the Z is facing to the right. We actually need that to face the opposite direction, so we'll go ahead and rotate that. I'll just type it in. So that the Z is facing in the opposite direction. So the player will walk up, trigger the interaction, and then he will be rotated to face the position that the anchor is facing. Also, it will physically move to line up with this point in space also. You'll have to play around with this a little bit to see what works best based on your animation. I've done a little bit of testing and this value seems to work okay for this case. So feel free to play around with it and move it as needed. The next thing we need to do is we need to set up some colliders on the chair. So we'll select the chair root object and we add our first box collider. The purpose of this collider is just to keep the player from walking through the box, walking through the chair, just to keep things a little bit more realistic. So I'll do something like that. And notice that this collider trigger is disabled. So we'll collapse that and we'll add the second collider. So this collider is going to be what actually triggers the interaction between the player and the chair. Come on. Okay. So you'll notice I position this second collider in front of the chair. The idea here is the player will walk into this volume, and that's how the chair and the player will know that they're within range of each other. You need to flag this as is trigger so that this area doesn't act as a physical barrier. It's supposed to be a volume that the player can enter and exit. One other thing I forgot to mention when positioning the anchors for the player, you need to make sure that you're in local space. Because if you're in global space, the world grid is a different coordinate axis than the local axis of the object that you're trying to configure. So you need to be looking at the local axis of the anchor to make sure that aligns with the way you would expect. Okay, so next we need to go ahead and add our first component, which is the snap event trigger. So we will type that in, snap event trigger, and we need a second component, which is the snap animation toggle animation pair component. These are the two components that are going to drive this interaction. So the snap event trigger is what begins the sequence. It tells the snap toggle animation pair to play its associated animations. This is just the entry point, and this is what actually does the work. So we're going to begin the setup by adding our first event here to the onInteract. We need to get a reference to the chair itself, so we're going to drag that into this field, and we're going to set a callback, snap toggle animation pair, which is this component down here, snap toggle animation pair, and we're going to assign the play toggle function. So again, the snap event trigger, this is just the entry point. When the user hits E on the keyboard, this is what recognizes that and tells the snap toggle animation pair to do its thing. So with that assigned, now we need to set up the meat of the interaction, which is the toggle animation pair. So you'll see there are a number of things that we require here. First thing is we need a reference to the player's transform. As we mentioned before, the anchor that we set up on the chair and the player's root transform are what we're going to align so that the player and the object line up for animation purposes. The next thing we need is a reference to the anchor itself, so we're going to drag that in. The alignment speed, this just controls how fast the animation and the alignment happens. And in this case, we do want to match rotation because we set up the ankle to face in the opposite direction so that the player is sitting facing the correct direction. The next thing we need is the animator from the player character. We're going to drag that in. And now we need to set up the animation clips. So since we're using the player prefab already has an animator on it and animator controller. So we'll go ahead and switch over here. So you'll see these are just some simple animations I could have done for the next one. For different interactions. So we have a stand up and a sit down animation, an open and close chest animation, and then we have a blend tree that controls the walk cycle and the idle animation. So we're going to need to grab reference to these 3 animation clips. One other thing that's just a quick additional note. These 2 clips are actually the same animation. The only difference is I'm just playing the animation in reverse when the player is going to stand up, just to keep things simple. Feel free to use whatever animations you need. So we need reference to all 3 of these animations. So the names need to match exactly. So to keep things safe, just go ahead and copy paste the names. So the first one, this is the walk cycle and the idle animation. We're going to add that into the character idle clip. And then we're going to grab the stand to sit. Plug that in here. This is where we begin. And need sit to stand to round out here. So what happens is when this kicks off, the sit animation is going to be played on the player character, and then when the user hits the E key a second time, it's going to play the stand up animation, and then it's going to immediately transition back into the standard idle move blend tree so that the player doesn't get stuck. So the next thing is the object configuration. So since we're not doing anything special with the chair, we don't actually need any of the chair configuration stuff. So what we'll do is we'll go to more options and we'll just hit disable object animation, and that will hide those options since we don't need those for this. Those are useful for if you have an object that needs to do something, that needs to play its own animations when the player interacts with it, then you can assign those there. Since the chair is just static and it's not going to do anything, we're just going to disable those. The last thing we need to do is set up a couple events. Now, these are useful for a couple things. For this particular setup, what I do is I'll assign a reference to the player in both the on enter started and on exit completed, these fields. And then we're going to call a function on the player character controller, the character control UnityEvents script. That's basically the character controller for this player prefab. And we're going to toggle player movement. So what this is going to do is when the interaction starts, it's going to stop the player from being able to move while sitting on the chair, just to keep things clean. And when the player gets up from the chair, we're going to toggle it again so it re-enables the player's movement. All right. So now switch back over to scene view, and that should be everything that we need to test this out. All right. So we're going to walk up to the chair, and we should see our UI. And the UI is not playing. So that means that there is an issue with the trigger volume on the chair. So let's take a look at that. Let's see. Select the chair and our second volume here. Let's see. Now maybe it's too small. Let's try making this just a little bit bigger. Okay. Let's give that a shot. Sometimes if your trigger volumes are too small, the player is not able to trigger them. So let's see if this will do it. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so the size of the collider is too small to start. So don't be afraid to make your colliders a little bit oversized just to make sure that everything triggers the way it's supposed to. So we walk up to the chair. You see we get the UnityEvents UI. pop up as we get close to the chair and we walk away. It appears and disappears. So we'll go ahead and hit E to interact, and you'll see the player sits on the chair. Now you'll notice that he's slightly out of alignment, slightly high and slightly off kilter. So what we could do there is just adjust the anchor so that he's a little bit better positioned. And like I mentioned before, this will just be a sort of you just have to play it by just eyeball it and do some tests and find what works best for your particular setup. And it should be better. So with that adjusted, let's give it another go and see if that's close enough to what we. So we'll walk out. And that looks better. Okay. So you see we hit E to interact again, the player gets off of the chair. Now he's able to resume normal movement. There's also spam protection built into this, so even as I spam the interact button, it doesn't ever get out of sync. The animations are controlled and everything fires as expected. And that's it. Thanks for watching. You can find more examples and documentation included in the SnapInteract package. Just check the documentation folder. If you found this helpful, be sure to check out the full toolkit on the Unity Asset Store and consider leaving me a review. Thank you so much.